Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today we're going to be talking about some major discoveries related to Kingsmarch. This is how the shipment system works, in detail with optimization strategies that are not the 50 million strategy that most people have been working with. That's actually pretty close to the best, but we think we've found something a little bit better by digging apart and reverse engineering the formula Grinding Gear Games used here. Now, this has been a case of a lot of people working together to solve this, but there are three names that I wanted to particularly call out: Puddle, Wisewolf, and Salmer. They have been providing an enormous amount of analysis and digging through people's publicly reported 50 million shipment results, asking people to do weird and wonderful different shipments and the like, in order to put all of this information together. Most of this research is not me. Actually, very little of it was me. All I was really involved in was a little bit of limit testing when it came to sending huge amounts of metals. The key thing that we've found here is that we're no longer going to be sending 50 million penta-crop shipments, i.e. a mixture of all 5 crops. The most optimized thing we've found now is going to be sending 315,000 corn, 315,000 wheat, and 8.505 million Thaumaturgic Dust, for a total of 17.1 million on a shipment. We'll get to why that is in a sec. It's a very complicated system, and it's quite possible that there's some error bars that mean that this is not absolutely exactly perfect. So it may be that there is actually a different figure that's just slightly better, but from what we can work out, this is the best you can do. So firstly, let's just start with the question of metals. Metals are bad. There are no publicly known strong use cases for metals. There's a few things that are mediocre, like you can send off your Verisium to Rivenfell in order to get back scarabs. This is a fine thing to do, it's just that it's not outstanding. This is not for a lack of limit testing. I have seen plenty of people send very large shipments of metals to various places, looking to see if you can get some spectacularly well-rolled rares, and the answer is no. You get things that are noticeably better than you would normally get, but they are nothing compared to what you can recombinate up, even recombinating with only a fairly small budget. So if you find a use for metals that is useful to you right now, then there's nothing that you're wasting by sending off those metals. You may as well do it. You're not really going to lose anything in doing so. The other thing that's not particularly important that we've found as a result of all of this testing, port quotas just don't do very much. It's not that they do nothing. They'll slightly nudge the numbers in your favor, but they're also pretty insignificant. And another major thing with metals is that they limit your ability to fill port quotas. Well, with port quotas not being very important, this ultimately doesn't matter very much either. However, there is one very important caveat to say here. Do not mix up metals and crops. The reason for this, it definitely dilutes the effect of Thaumaturgic Dust that you send with those mixed shipments, and it also appears, but is not proven, to be just worse than sending the metal in one batch and then the crops in another. So with all of that in mind, there's a couple of good uses for metals. Mostly it's Verisium to Rivenfell for scarabs, or you can send bismuth to Kalguur for ward bases, or you can send off shipments of metals hoping they get hijacked by the pirate boss so that you get to fight the pirate boss and potentially get the quite good gloves that he's got and also a very large amount of gold from him. That's really it. You do, however, want to continue looting metal deposits in maps, partly because they drop a fair bit of loot anyway. There's just a lot of monsters to kill around them all, but also because when you do them, you'll get an equal amount of gold, and that basically pays for the cost of smelting the metal and a little bit more, so you end up coming out ahead. Now, there are two methods by which the rewards of this mechanic scale, and we're going to be talking about crop-only shipments from here on. There's item quantity and item rarity. Now, this is not the terms as you would normally use them in Path of Exile. So we're not talking about when you kill a monster and you've got increased item rarity on your stat or increased item quantity from the zone that you're in, any of these sorts of shenanigans. Here, we're talking about rarity in its plain English meaning, which is divergent from what it normally means in Path of Exile. So let's start with quantity first. There is a hard cap of 800 currency items on any shipment return. However, there is a more severe cap of only 500 that applies if you send only one type of crop. This is something that they've done in order to deal with a particular type of min-maxing you would otherwise do. Without this, it would be optimal to just send wheat. You would be sending nothing but wheat all the time, and so they've gone and they've put in this extra little factor to make things a little bit more complicated and to make it so that you need to think a little bit more about what you're doing. You can get to 800 quantity by sending 630,000 corn and 630,000 wheat. Or alternately, you can get there with 315,000 corn, 315,000 wheat, and 8,505,000 Thaumaturgic Dust. Dust is able to substitute for some of these crops. The exact formula for this quantity scaling isn't known, but all 50 million shipments will cap, or they'll be within a rounding error of capping. It seems like if you send more than 1.26 million crops, you will cap out, and that will include when Thaumaturgic Dust mimics the effect of more crops. More on that later. Now, rarity, however, is much more complicated. It's not increased item rarity as it normally means in Path of Exile. That doesn't apply to currency at all. There are two ways that Grinding Gear Games could have set things up around increasing the rarity of the currency that you get. The first one is rolling multiple times and giving you the rarest currency outcome. So you roll 16 times, you get Divine Orb, Chaos Orb, Val Orb, Regal Orb, Chaos Orb, Alteration Orb by 10, and then the game goes, okay, what's the rarest of those? It's a Divine Orb, let's give you that. Or maybe there's a Sacred Orb in there and it goes, okay, well, we'll give you the Sacred Orb because that's rarer than the Divine Orb. That's one way they could have done it. They didn't do it that way. If they had done it that way, the proof would be that you would never get transmutations, or almost never get transmutations, and you would seldom see alterations and augmentations. That's not the case. You get those currencies a lot. In fact, they're the most common of the currencies that you're going to get from shipments, except when we come to port affinities in a sec, which might nudge them around. You might start seeing something like alterations or even alchemies jump up and become the most common. What they do instead is they put the drop weights of these currencies into some sort of condensing function. That's the way that they chose. Now, the formula that they've used has been reverse engineered. And the way it works, instead of respecting the normal drop weightings for currency, we'll call that W, they respect W raised to the power of R, where R is a condensing factor. There's some pretty wild stuff that this maths can do if you take it to extreme levels. Normally speaking, you get 10 alteration orbs for every 3 chaos orbs that drop in the game. However, if the R value was positive 3, you'd get 1,000 alteration orbs for every 27 chaos orbs. In short, the gulf between these would widen to be overwhelming. But if R is less than 1 but more than 0, then the gulf becomes smaller than it would have otherwise been. For example, if the R value was 0.5, for every roughly 3.16 alteration orbs that you got, you'd be seeing about 1.73 of the chaos orbs. And so that's sort of actually more favorable than 1 to 2. However, you go further than this. You could go to 0. If R value was 0, then for every 1 alteration, you'd get 1 chaos orb. And you'd also get 1 mirror shard. If you were to go even further than that, say to -3, then for every 1,000 chaos orbs that you got, you'd get 27 alterations. And the number of mirror shards that you got would be absolutely astronomical. There's a pretty good reason they didn't let you go as far as -3. In fact, the lowest we've been able to get this condensing factor is about 1/3. Now, with our modeling, a 50 million shipment will have an R value of 0.332 in what we'd term one of the best case scenarios, and that is that it is maximizing the number of crops while keeping 2 crops in the shipment. So that is an equal parts corn of wheat, but also with enough Thaumaturgic Dust to bring it up to 50 million. This gives an R value of 0.332, which might actually be exactly 1/3. Using the number we've measured though, rather than the one that you might guess that it is, this would condense down mirror shards from being 8,000 times as rare as an alteration orb is normally, down to being only 19.77 times as rare. And think of the number of alteration orbs that you get on a 50 million shipment. It's usually pretty substantial. It's many dozens. So for every 20 of those, you should expect to see 1 mirror shard. In fact, maybe it actually is exactly 20. For those of you that have got a bit more of a mathematics background, every time that you multiply the size of your shipment by the mathematical constant E, our line of best fit decreases the R value by 0.1235. This could be not exactly right. It could be that it's actually 1/8, but that's what we've found it to be. That's the line of best fit that we've got. So why are we talking about 17 million, not 50 million? Well, it turns out that a fair bit of the conventional wisdom around shipments was wrong. Shipment value does not appear to matter at all. What matters is the total number of crops that are sent. More precisely, it's the logarithm of the total number of crops that are sent. And that's the key thing here. Because a logarithm function's applied, that condenses big numbers much more than it condenses small numbers. And it turns out the position you want to be in is just after you hit that 800 hard cap on currency. So this is met at just over 17 million for those corn and wheat shipments. And it's met later if you've got other crops that cost more, that add more to the shipment value. For example, if your crop is half corn, half blue Zanthimum, you're going to be looking at a higher number than 17 million here in order to still get this 1.26 million crops, which is where it turns out that you hit this maximum of 800 individual rewards returned. Now beyond this, rarity does keep going up, but because it's based on the logarithm of the number of crops, it just doesn't go up fast enough to make up for the additional amount of material that you're sending out each time. So basically, it's better to send more boats at the 17 million range than it is to send a single boat at 50, although the difference is very small. So let's start with what the modeling looks like if you were to send a penta-crop scenario. So this is where you're sending an equal amount of all 5 crops. So this means you start with 10,000 wheat, 10,000 corn, 10,000 blue xanth, 10,000 orgourd, and 10,000 pumpkins, and you just keep scaling that up until you hit 50 million. Well, if you send equal amounts, this is what the modeling seems to indicate. The number of mirror shards per 50 million that you send off is about 1.7 at the maximum, and then it actually slightly decays as you start sending more shipments, and it ends up closer to 1.65. Now you can do slightly better than this by going corn and wheat, and that's what I'm going to recommend that you do. But you can see it's a very small difference, but it is a slight difference. And that's because once you hit that 800 return cap, there's not really enough space to grow beyond that. However, it is important to say that whilst this is a conclusion that was drawn from the data, the margins of error are big enough that it could actually be the other way around. We think it's this way, we're 95% sure it's this way, but it could be the other way around. What about if you want to optimize for divine orbs instead? Well, here it's actually a little bit more stark, that you want to go slightly smaller, closer to 1.05, close to 1.1 million crops sent off, and you get a sharp decrease in the amount of divine orbs that you would expect per 50 million value that you send, from 13, i.e. 1 divine orb per 4 million that you send off, down to something like 8 as you start getting to larger shipments again. So again, the summary here, secure your 800 rewards any way you can, at least be within a rounding error of that, and then don't scale it further. This one's more important if you're in solo self-found. In Trade League, mirror shards are completely dominant in terms of the rewards, at least in the existing Settlers League. That, of course, may all change in the Settlers event starting in a couple of days. Now let's make things more complicated, shall we? Let's talk about port biases and how to avoid them from wrecking your shipment. Certain ports apply a multiplier to certain types of currency. This applies before the condensing factor applies, and as a result, it mostly gets squished out by that condensing factor, but it is still there. It's important to note that it seems to behave differently for quality modifying currencies, and it seems to do less damage when you're increasing the magnitude of those quality modifying currencies. This is why you may have heard people say, don't send big shipments to Kalguur. You're going to be increasing your chances of getting alteration orbs, and this will come potentially at the expense of mirror shards. Whereas if you were increasing your chances of getting armorers, scraps, or whetstones by sending it to either Ribenfell or Nakanu, this is going to come instead at the expense of better quality modifying currencies, such as gem cutters, prisms, and cartographers' chisels, and glassblowers' baubles, but those just aren't as important to lose. And for that reason, the port affinities for Kalguur are actually more detrimental if you're sending off a bunch of wheat. And because wheat's the crop that's the fastest to grow, and you're going to have the most of it, and it is actually the best crop to grow, that means that this is a significant factor. So, the short version of this, Ribenfell and Nakanu, the best ports if you're sending off wheat. If you're not sending off wheat though, other things can be good. You might however notice one thing that needs to be said here, and that is that Kalguur has a very, very good port affinity for blue Zanthimum, specifically for divine orbs. This is not quite as good as a mirror shard affinity would be, at least if you play in Trade League, but it is worth keeping in mind. The best strategy that we've come up with for exploiting this is actually sending fairly small size shipments off to Kalguur as often as you can, in order to try and cash this in using all your blue Zanthimum there. So send all your blue Xanth off to Kalguur, save the rest in your wheat and corn to send off to Ribenfell and Nakanu. As for whether you send to Ribenfell or Nakanu, we'll come back to that later. A strong R value, so that's one that is far lower than 1. However, this is something that is going to reduce the effect of these port biases. So that's some of the things to keep in mind around port biases. Probably the most significant mistake you can make here is sending large amounts of wheat to Pondium and or to Tay or Nui. These are generally pretty bad spots to send shipments off to at the moment, unless you're sending something that has no wheat at all in it. The other factor with Kalguur is that it does impose a 10% increase in risk compared to the other ports, and that ends up being bad news sometimes. Whether that's a factor for you or not is an open question. Now, the key thing to keep in mind here, there's a little bit of a balancing act. The rarer the crop you're sending, the rarer the currencies that are going to have these port biases attached to them. That's a good thing. However, at the same time, the rarer the crop is, the longer it's going to take to grow that crop. And it turns out that in the end, wheat and corn are just better. Especially because if you send a Ribenfeld or Nakano, you can mostly avoid any detrimental effect on these port biases because the Armorer's Scraps and Whetstones are not going to be competing for slots with your Mirror Shards. Now, if you're in solo self-found though, there's a whole bunch of information in this table that's important to note. If you need Horizon Orbs, there is nothing wrong at all with sending a bunch of orgourd off to Nakano in order to get them. This is a really useful way to target farm specific currencies that you want in that solo self-found game mode, especially because Mirror Shards are just not very important in this game mode. In trade though, Mirror Shards just dominate everything else. They are so much of the value that you'll get out of this mechanic that you should probably ignore everything else that you can get from it. If you do want more Exalted Orbs, don't get them by sending Blue Xanth to Teonui. Instead, get them by optimizing for Mirror Shards, sell a Mirror Shard, and buy all the Exalted Orbs you could ever want. Okay, so how does this R scaling work? Broadly speaking, the community thought that R was scaled off shipment value, when in fact it is scaled off the total number of crops sent off. For those of you with a mathematics background, it seems like the R value scales linearly with the logarithm of the amount of crops that you're sending after that's modified for Thaumaturgic Dust, and that it is also hard capped above at 1. When I was in editing, I realized that this felt like it was a little bit math heavy speak. So the simple version of this is, if you think of how fast exponential scaling is, logarithmic scaling is the reverse of this. And the amount that R goes down is slowed down to logarithmic level. And that's the reason that it's kind of hard to get R to be anything lower than about a half. And it takes a massive investment in order to get it down to a third. In fact, we mapped out a line of best fit on this to work out when it is that you would hit an R value of 0 or negative R values that would cause you to get ridiculous amounts of Mirror Shards. And this doesn't happen until very high 9 figures shipment value, like 736 million to hit 0, and something like 10 billion to hit high enough negative value that it ends up having a big impact. Ultimately, it's better to send more smaller shipments than a couple of really, really big ones as a result of this, especially given that the game doesn't even let you send things larger than 50 million. So if your R value would be higher than 1, it's capped at 1, and if it would be lower than 1, then you get the benefits of the lower value. Now let's take a quick side note to talk about tattoos and runes. And the formula that Grinding Gear games use here are not completely cracked. We don't really know exactly how these get distributed. A couple of things to note though, journey tattoos are so rare that people's attitude was these basically don't exist. If you happen to get one, that's a bonus, but you shouldn't count on it and you shouldn't optimize for it because they're so rare that even if you can triple your chance of getting them, triple an infinitesimal chance of getting a 90 divine tattoo doesn't really matter very much. Now, if you're playing in Settlers League proper, I would advise you to send to tattoo ports because at the moment, power runes have gotten a lot cheaper, whereas the suppression tattoos are very expensive. If on the other hand, you're playing in the Settlers Reboot event, I would advise you that early on, you're definitely going to want to send to rune ports because I think we're going to see the most expensive power runes that we've ever seen in this Settlers Reboot event. However, not much else is known other than certain level thresholds for them. So if it's optimal to send to tattoo ports, this is going to be one of those things I hate saying to people, but it is going to be slightly optimal to turn in your shipments on a level 35 character. Now, the exact moment at which the game determines what you're going to receive for a shipment is a little bit mysterious, but I believe it to be when Tujen addresses you as you walk up to him. So if that's correct, you're going to want to go in with a level 35 character if you can. The reason for this is that by going in on a level 35 character, you are ruling out the chance of getting a journey tattoo, which is unfortunate, but you basically have very little chance. It's not worth optimizing for. And in exchange for that, you are banning Cartographer's Chisels, Instilling Orbs, Enkindling Orbs, and possibly a couple of other currencies. I think Horizon Orbs as well. When you're banning those currencies, that slightly increases the chances of getting Mirror Shards instead. So that's a slight optimization if you are going to be sending to tattoo ports. If you're sending to a rune port though, even in Settlers League now, it's still going to be worthwhile not doing that. Instead, send and receive on a level 83 or higher character so that power runes remain in the pool. Power runes are uncommon, but they're not staggeringly rare the way that journey tattoos are, and you'll probably get one of them on average on your 17 million shipments. It's not really worth sacrificing that for a tiny increase in your chance of getting Mirror Shards. But very important reminder that if rune ports are better in your league, you definitely want level 83 plus, because that is required, absolutely required, for you to be able to get power runes. So what about Thaumaturgic Dust? How does this work? This has been known for a while, and the community is right on this front. Dust increases the shipment value. All the testing that we've done indicates that it's just the same as increasing the other materials by the same percentage. For example, if you send 10,000 wheat on its own, I believe the shipment value to be 120,000. If you then add in 60,000 dust, that'll raise the shipment value to 180,000. That's a 50% jump, and so that Thaumaturgic Dust is just going to be like applying 50% more to the amount of wheat that you're sending. It'd be like you send 15,000 wheat instead of sending 10,000. There is a point where dust has diminishing returns, and that will be obvious if you look at the shipment value. And beyond that, there isn't much testing as to how it affects your shipments, just that we know that there's no truly remarkable results. For example, if you were to send 10 units of wheat, 120 shipment value, alongside 1.2 million units of Thaumaturgic Dust, I believe that your shipment value will be listed at something like 120,000, and it'll be just like you sent 10,000 units of wheat and got the 120,000 that way. That's my belief as to how those weird lopsided ones work. It's just generally not tested very much because people have got bad results from the first attempts, and they've decided, I don't want to send a whole bunch of value of dust and get very little for it back in return. So putting it all together, what are our optimal strategies? At current Trade League prices, and this assumes that you've got rank 11 bonus on farming, you want to start with your middle plots and have one of them on corn, one of them on wheat always. Then for the rest of them, you're going to want to do one of two things. The first option is to have a total of 2 plots on corn, a total of 2 plots on wheat, and one plot that alternates between corn and wheat in order to balance your production of the two of them. Then your last one will be on blue Zanthimum in order to get the benefits of the level 9 bonus for farming. With respect to this blue Zanth, you're going to want to send it about 10,000 at a time to Kalguur, and you're fishing for divine orbs here. You won't get one every time you send off 10,000, but you will get quite a number of them, and it'll be worth your while. The other one is to optimize the rank 9 farming bonus upgrade, and that is by making sure you always have one of each crop. Now, your central ones, the middle plots, the ones that are the best after that bonus for rank 11, they're going to be 1 times corn, 1 times wheat. Then you'll have 1 pumpkin, 1 orgourd, 1 blue Zanthimum, and then 1 flex slot that is mostly going to be producing corn, but that is occasionally going to crop us over to be wheat when you need to catch up to the amount of corn that you're producing. Also, if you've only got a limited number of rank 10 farmers, or if you've got some farmers that are better than the others, put those on the middle plots. That's going to be your optimization strategy for farming. Then, when you're ready to send off shipments, 315,000 corn, 315,000 wheat, and 8,505,000 dust at a time, as often as you can to Nakanu if the market is favoring tattoos over runes, or if the market is currently favoring runes over tattoos, then send to Ribenfell instead. And if you go with Ribenfell, make absolutely certain it is a level 83 plus character. All the blue Zanthimum that you collect, send that off to Kalguur. And if you are farming meaningful amounts of pumpkin and orgourd, what you want to do is just occasionally replace 315,000 wheat or 315,000 corn with 315,000 of one of these crops, and still continue with the same general process. When you do send off those shipments though, you will need to use more dust, because you'll need to add enough dust to double the total shipment value size. One complexity can come up here, and that is if Thaumaturgic Dust gets more expensive. If that's the case, what you want to do is just use the Thaumaturgic Dust you self-farm, and then just increase the amount of corn and wheat that you send, decreasing the amount of dust, so that you still have an equal amount of corn and wheat that you send off, and so that your shipments are still in that 17.1 million range. That'll be the optimum approach, but it's just going to take a little bit of fiddling around with the exact numbers to get them right. So that's a Trade League approach. What about if you're in solo self-found where mirror shards are just a vanity trophy? In this situation, you probably want to optimize for divines. They're the thing you're going to have the least of in a solo self-found environment. You probably also want sacred orbs a bit more than people playing trade do, so there's something else to keep an eye out for. But all the strategies that increase the amount of divines that you get tend to be fairly good at getting you sacred orbs as well. Except maybe blue Zanthimum to Kalguur, but you can do that on the side as well. Now with the solo self-found approach though, you are more likely to want to send boats off to Kalguur. Even though you're going to be incurring that 10% risk, you'll have to balance up the risk and reward on that. Key thing is, if you do send off 17 million boats, sacred orbs will come if you want them. Maybe not on your first boat, but they will come. They're uncommon, but they're not truly rare. Anyways, that is everything about a super complex, super rewarding, super lucrative mechanic. Whether you're continuing to play in the Settlers League proper, jumping over into the Settlers reboot with the Necropolis mods and all the craziness of having Divine Orb mods sometimes showing up there, or whether you're just interested in a piece of Path of Exile history, hopefully this has been fun. I'm going to leave it there. May the corn that you send to Kalguur provide you with Val Orbs that have interesting results.